The member for Nunavut.
Uqaqtittiji, in response to the throne speech, I had asked if the minister would reverse their colonial approach or would Indigenous rights be violated. The Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations replied with promises about nation-building projects, a stronger economy, and a stronger Canada. I do not see how Canada can become stronger when rights of Indigenous peoples are violated by the current government. Fundamental Indigenous rights are being denied. Many Indigenous people still do not have access to clean drinking water. Inuit children are going to school hungry. Families are sleeping in overcrowded or molded houses. Free, prior, and informed consent is disregarded. How quickly Bill C-5 was passed showed the true colors of the Liberals. They do not respect Indigenous peoples. They prevented free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. Liberals only hold meetings with Indigenous nations to win votes. When C-5 was pushed through Parliament, thousands of Indigenous peoples had been and remain evacuated from forest fires. While Indigenous peoples coped with losing their livelihoods, Liberals violated their rights to give free, prior, and informed consent to Bill C-5. The Liberals' goal of building Canada strong oppresses Indigenous nations. Canada strong keeps Indigenous peoples in poverty, keeps Indigenous peoples without infrastructure such as housing, infrastructure to provide safe drinking water, and to generate economies among Indigenous strength. In 2021, Canada adopted UNDRIP, which commits Canada to taking necessary measures to ensure Canadian laws are consistent with UNDRIP. On free, prior, and informed consent, I quote, UNDRIP will provide all peoples with the right to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The Liberals see FPIC as a barrier to economic goals. Their investments in natural resource development manipulate Indigenous communities to economic development disguised as economic reconciliation. There is no reconciliation in taking land and resources from Indigenous peoples without consent. The Prime Minister had meetings with Indigenous peoples after Bill C-5 was passed. This is not respect to Indigenous peoples, especially when they specifically called for the delay of passing Bill C-5. The Liberals' Indigenous Advisory Council is another Liberal ploy to deceive Canadians into thinking Indigenous voices are being heard. A Council of Indigenous Advisors is not a suitable replacement for consultation with Indigenous rights holders. In what way will the Advisory Council's role respect right holders? Uqaqtittiji.
Honorable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the chance to further answer your question. Today, I speak in strong support of the government's unwavering commitment to consulting with Indigenous people and fostering genuine opportunities for Indigenous equity in major projects. Canada stands at a pivotal moment in its journey into reconciliation, one that calls for true partnership and meaningful action. This commitment is not just a promise, it's embedded in our legislation and operational practices. Ensuring Indigenous rights are upheld and Indigenous knowledge is actively incorporated into assessments for all projects of national interest. A critical feature of the newly created Major Project Office is its Indigenous Advisory Council. This council brings together 11 exceptional representatives from First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and modern treaty and self-governing communities from across the country. The Council's expert advice shapes policies and improves operational practices, guaranteeing Indigenous perspective and interest are truly embedded in major project decision-making. This is not just an advisory role and in name only. Its contribution will have tangible impacts on project design, execution, and outcome, reflecting our dedication to nation, government to the government, and Inuit Crown relationships, grounded in respects and recognition of rights, including the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. Nous savons que la réconciliation et la transformation.
We know that reconciliation and economic transformation go hand in hand with the inclusion of Indigenous peoples. That is why the government has broadened the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. It was initially a $5 billion program, and now $10 billion are earmarked to support Indigenous peoples' participation in capital, not only in energy and natural resources projects, but also in infrastructure, transportation, and trade projects. This program addresses the ongoing obstacles and enables Indigenous communities to participate in important projects, which will open new paths towards prosperity. But our work doesn't end there. The Major Projects Bureau has made important commitments, $40 million over 2 years, to strengthen Indigenous peoples' capacity to participate in major projects. Right from the beginning, these targeted investments will increase technical skills, will use clean technology, and support Indigenous communities in their energy transitions and sustainable resource development. Mr. Speaker, moving forward with reconciliation is not only the right thing to do, it's also essential for Canada's long-term economic growth and for environmental management. Our success will depend on solid and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples, who are both stewards and innovators on this land. We are taking bold and historic measures to guarantee that Indigenous communities have access to capital and can be a real part of the prosperity that is led to by these projects.
For Nunavut.
Uqaqtittiji, it is clear that the Liberals have no concern for Indigenous peoples and their rights. Their so-called consultations were nothing more than a publicity stunt to limit backlash. The Inuit Kanatami, Assembly of First Nations, and Métis Nations expressed their concerns on Bill C-5. However, it was still rushed through to become law. At the same time, this Liberal government is projecting cuts to Indigenous Services Canada. How will making cuts to the Indigenous Services Canada to programs and services mean losing investments in Indigenous people's well-being and support? How will this Liberal government support Indigenous people's well-being?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire au ministre de l'Énergie.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy.
Speaker, I think the honourable member will appreciate a few examples of Indigenous-owned and partly owned projects that our government helped fund. Let's start in Saskatchewan with the Bekevar Wind Energy Project. This is one of Canada's largest wind farms. The Cowessess First Nation is a majority owner, and it's backed by $50 million in federal support. Then there's the Oneida Energy Storage Project, a leading example of large-scale battery storage. This facility is a partnership that includes the Six Nations of the Grand River Development Corporation, Northland Power, NR Store, and Aecon Group. It stands out as one of the largest Indigenous partner energy storage facility in North America and received a $50 million federal government. There are many more examples I can speak to, but let me clear that we're committed to reconciliation, to duty to consult, and supporting Indigenous equity and leadership.